Empires rose, thrones fell, yet their rulers left stories time could never erase. Welcome to a new story. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's begin the untold journey of crowns, power, and history. The woman the court feared as Catherine the Great began her life in Russia as a stranger. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, she arrived in St. Petersburg at the age of 14, handpicked to marry the heir to the Russian throne. Her marriage to Grand Duke Peter, the future Peter III, was not the beginning of a love story. It was the start of a long and dangerous political apprenticeship. In the cold and unfamiliar world of the Russian court, Sophie transformed herself. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy, adopting the name Ekaterina, and began learning the language, the customs, and the unspoken rules that governed court survival. Her early years were marked by isolation and scrutiny, caught between a husband who showed her little affection and an empress, Elizabeth, who viewed her with both hope and suspicion. But while others saw a young foreign bride, Catherine quietly took measure of everyone around her. She understood quickly that power in Russia did not flow cleanly from title or blood. It moved through proximity, patience, and perception. Catherine observed how Empress Elizabeth ruled not just through command, but through control of factions, fear of exile, and careful manipulation of noble loyalty. Catherine, though excluded from real power, absorbed these lessons. She began forging relationships with key court figures, reading widely in Enlightenment philosophy, and studying the histories of rulers who had outlasted their critics. Her marriage, meanwhile, became a battlefield of silence and contempt. Peter's erratic behavior, his admiration for Prussia, Russia's enemy, and his disdain for Russian tradition made him increasingly unpopular. Catherine, by contrast, made herself presentable, fluent, and devout. While her husband alienated, she adapted. Even without formal power, she was building a reputation, quietly, steadily, and deliberately. The court around her remained divided. Some dismissed her as a soft-spoken outsider with no base of support. Others watched her with growing unease, sensing that her charm concealed ambition. Empress Elizabeth, aging and often in poor health, remained the ultimate gatekeeper. Catherine understood that her position, though secure in name, was never guaranteed. In private, she began assembling a small but loyal network: guardsmen, noblewomen, clerics, and thinkers. These alliances were not dramatic or public. They were quiet handshakes, shared confidences, and whispered agreements. Her ability to listen, to hold back, and to promise just enough became her greatest weapons. In a court where suspicion was currency, Catherine became both invisible and indispensable. By the time Elizabeth's health began to fail, Catherine had learned to move through the palace like a shadow. She made no public claims, raised no challenges, and offered no opposition. Yet behind the scenes, she was preparing. Her husband's unpopularity, the deep divisions within the military, and the church's need for a ruler with vision, not volatility, all shaped her strategy. She did not rush. She waited. And with every misstep Peter made, Catherine's silence became more powerful. She was no longer just the foreign bride. She was a woman many believed could lead. Even as she bowed her head in court ceremonies, even as she dined with those who underestimated her, Catherine was calculating the path to the throne. Her rise had not yet begun in full, but it was already inevitable. Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst entered the Russian court with little more than a title and a foreign name. At just 14 years old, she was brought into the empire not for love or loyalty, but to secure an alliance. The marriage to Grand Duke Peter, heir to the Russian throne, was arranged by Empress Elizabeth, who saw political use in the union. Upon her conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, Sophia became Catherine Alexeyevna, Grand Duchess of Russia. But the new name did not bring comfort. The halls of the Winter Palace were cold in more than climate. The marriage, from its earliest days, was marked by indifference and scorn. Peter, raised in Holstein and shaped by Prussian tutors, showed little regard for Russian customs or for Catherine herself. He was impulsive, immature, and often cruel in subtle ways. She, by contrast, remained outwardly quiet, masking discomfort with careful obedience. But behind that silence, she was watching. Catherine began learning more than language and religion. She studied the Russian court, the way favors were earned, the way decisions were delayed, the way exile hung like a blade over every noble's head. She noticed how loyalty shifted depending on whispers, how clergymen held power equal to generals, and how Empress Elizabeth maintained control not through fear alone, but through the promise of survival. Catherine adapted. She kept her German accent soft. She made herself useful at public events. In private, she started cultivating personal relationships, each chosen with purpose. She read political theory and kept detailed notes. She listened more than she spoke. Her husband spent his time idolizing Frederick of Prussia, practicing military drills in private rooms and mocking Russian traditions. But Catherine began to understand them. Inside palace walls, rank did not guarantee protection. Peter, though heir, was resented by many for his behavior, his German preferences, and his disregard for Russian Orthodox values. This growing unease around him allowed Catherine a rare kind of movement. In salons and corridors, she formed tentative bonds with minor nobles, chambermaids, officers, and priests. Many saw her as harmless, a foreign girl with no true power. But each alliance had weight. She repaid kindness with discretion. She remembered debts. And while Empress Elizabeth kept a distant but watchful eye, Catherine slowly built something fragile but real, a network. These connections were not yet loyalists, but they were listeners. And in a court where everyone feared being forgotten, being listened to mattered. The isolation of palace life gave Catherine time to study the rituals of the court, the pace of decision-making, the personalities behind every official title. She paid attention to who attended which ceremony, who left early, who avoided whom. She learned when silence was more useful than presence. But every move drew attention. Some, especially among the Empress's inner circle, viewed her growing confidence with suspicion. Her foreign origins made her an easy target for rumor, her barren marriage. In the early summer of 1762, the Russian Empire stood on uncertain ground. Empress Elizabeth was gone, and her successor, Peter III, had ruled for barely 6 months. His policies, shaped by his deep admiration for Frederick of Prussia, confused and alienated the Russian elite. He withdrew Russia from the 7 Years' War, reversing years of costly but strategic campaigns. He ordered sweeping reforms of the army without consulting its commanders. He threatened church holdings, angering Orthodox clergy, and surrounded himself with German advisors who held little respect for Russian tradition. Within weeks, he had made powerful enemies across the state. among nobles, priests, and generals alike. But Peter remained unaware of how quickly these resentments were coalescing and how close they had drawn to the woman who had once stood in his shadow. Catherine, now 33 and long dismissed as merely the Grand Duchess, had been preparing for this moment with quiet calculation. Though she lacked official authority, her network within the Guards regiments, the Senate, and key aristocratic families had grown strong enough to act. She moved with careful timing. On the morning of June 28, 1762, with Peter away from the capital, Catherine left her residence and made her way to the Izmailovsky Regiment barracks. There, flanked by loyal officers, she was declared sovereign. Word spread swiftly. Within hours, troops loyal to her had secured bridges, roads, and the capital itself. The church blessed her ascension. Key nobles offered public allegiance. There was no civil unrest, no mass violence, no dramatic battle. The transition was swift because the groundwork had been laid not through force, but through years of silence, observation, and strategic alignment. Peter III, stunned by the speed and scale of the defection, attempted to flee but was captured. He abdicated under pressure and was taken into custody. A few days later, he was dead. The official cause given was a sudden illness, but many in the court understood the truth. Peter had been removed to prevent any future claim. His death was not just the end of a reign, it was the erasure of a path the empire had briefly followed and rejected. Catherine, now in full command, took the throne not as a regent or consort, but as Empress and autocrat of all the Russias. Her coronation was not simply a ceremonial act, it was a declaration of continuity and a warning to those who might challenge it. The coup had been clean in execution, but its implications ran deep. Catherine's rise marked a turning point in Imperial Russia, where legitimacy no longer came only from lineage, but from control of the army, the church, and the court. Her authority was born not from inheritance, but from orchestration. And while her supporters celebrated her intellect and steadiness, others saw in her reign the dangerous precedent of power taken rather than passed down. The shadow of betrayal followed her into the palace, and though she now wore the crown, she knew the throne she sat on had not been designed for her. It had been taken, and it could be taken again. Catherine's rule, though firm and far-reaching, was not built on isolation. The court she shaped was alive with influence, driven not just by laws and decrees, but by intimacy, proximity, and carefully chosen alliances. Among her closest were trusted advisors who began as favorites and often became lovers. These men did not simply serve in private. They held positions of political consequence. Some were granted estates, others elevated to roles in the military or diplomatic corps. Their rise stirred envy and speculation. But for Catherine, each relationship was both personal and strategic. She rewarded loyalty, but she also tested it, ensuring that devotion to her person translated into service to her state. The line between emotional closeness and political usefulness blurred behind the closed doors of the palace. At the same time, her son Paul remained on the margins of her government. He had been born into a court that saw him as the legitimate heir, but his mother's firm grip on power kept him at a distance. Catherine withheld key responsibilities, fearing his instability and lack of judgment. He was educated and titled, but not trusted. As years passed, Paul's resentment deepened. He surrounded himself with his own small circle of loyalists, men who whispered promises of a new order, of reform, of revenge. Catherine knew of these sentiments. She monitored his movements, limited his exposure to foreign dignitaries, and ensured that his name rarely appeared beside matters of state. His exclusion was not an oversight. It was a calculation meant to protect the empire and her position within it. Inside the court, appearances mattered. Banquets, operas, and diplomatic gatherings filled the calendar, each an opportunity to display unity and strength. But beneath the surface, loyalties shifted constantly. Nobles who once aligned with Catherine's choices quietly questioned her reliance on personal favorites. Others, fearing loss of position, tried to anticipate her moods, adjusting allegiances with subtlety. The palace, rich with grandeur, was equally rich with doubt. The Empress remained the central force, but the court that bowed to her also studied her every move, seeking signs of vulnerability. In this environment, Catherine balanced praise and punishment with care. Promotions were deliberate, dismissals were discreet. She knew the danger of appearing too dependent on any one man, too forgiving of dissent, or too open to challenge from within. Beyond her immediate circle, regional governors and military leaders watched her court with their own ambitions. Some offered loyalty, others waited. Catherine responded by maintaining a strong flow of correspondence, rewarding distant allies with titles and recognition, while quietly removing those whose support seemed conditional. She kept the empire running, not just through strength, but through constant adjustment, reshaping alliances, replacing administrators, and reminding all who served that favor was never permanent. But even in this controlled environment, tensions lingered, the whispers did not stop. Some pointed to Paul, others speculated about foreign influence or disloyal nobles. Catherine had constructed a system where power flowed from her hands, but the same structure required constant vigilance. And even the sharpest eyes cannot see every shadow. In 1773, the Russian Empire faced a threat not from foreign borders, but from within its own soil. In the vast, volatile provinces east of Moscow, where serfs labored under brutal conditions and Cossack traditions clashed with imperial rule, a man named Pugachev stirred unrest into open rebellion. He claimed to be Peter III, the overthrown and allegedly murdered emperor, returned to reclaim his throne. His voice carried a message of vengeance against landlords, justice for the poor, and freedom from imperial chains. In regions where Catherine's reforms had barely touched the lives of the peasantry, where taxation weighed heavy and landowners ruled unchecked, his words found willing ears. What began as a distant rumor grew into a mass uprising. Tens of thousands joined, disenfranchised serfs, former soldiers, Cossacks stripped of their privileges. They brought with them not just weapons, but rage and a vision of a different order. Catherine, who had long presented herself as an enlightened monarch, a student of Voltaire, a reformer of education and law, now faced a challenge that philosophy could not resolve. The rebellion spread quickly through the Volga basin, capturing fortresses, executing officials, and seizing supplies. For nearly a year, imperial authority crumbled in swaths of the countryside. Cities like Kazan burned. Noble estates were looted. Entire districts fell silent under the control of rebel forces. Pugachev's movement revealed how little control the central government held beyond the capital, how wide the gap had grown between reform on paper and reality in the provinces. Catherine's court in St. Petersburg watched with growing alarm. Her response came not in the language of tolerance, but in the instruments of war. She deployed experienced generals to crush the uprising, first hesitant, then absolute. The imperial army, equipped with artillery and disciplined ranks, slowly encircled the rebel strongholds. Villages suspected of harboring insurgents were razed. Survivors were interrogated. In early 1775, Pugachev was betrayed by his own men, captured, and brought to Moscow in chains. His public execution was meant to close the chapter with certainty, but it did not erase the memory of what had happened. The revolt had left more than bodies. It had exposed a wound beneath the empire's surface, one built into the structure of serfdom itself. Catherine had long resisted calls to abolish it, fearing the loss of noble support and the collapse of agricultural stability. Now, that resistance had a cost, counted in blood and burned fields. In the aftermath, Catherine moved swiftly to tighten control. She reorganized provincial administration, increased surveillance of local officials, and expanded the powers of governors to act without delay. She no longer assumed that loyalty would hold if neglected. At court, she resumed the language of enlightenment, commissioning educational projects and legal codifications. But in the provinces, the tone had changed. Authority became more visible. Dissent, less tolerated. The uprising had forced a choice between idealism and control, and the empire had chosen control. Catherine, once hopeful that governance could evolve through reason, now governed with a sharper edge. Enlightenment remained her banner, but it now flew over a land marked by fire. By the 1780s, Catherine's reign stood at its most commanding point. The empire had grown in territory, influence, and ambition. Through a series of calculated wars and treaties, Russia had secured its hold over Crimea, extending its reach to the Black Sea. Naval ports opened, trade routes widened, and new cities were carved into the map. Their foundations laid in the name of modernity. Diplomats across Europe began to speak of Russia not as a frontier power, but as a force that could no longer be ignored. Within court walls, Catherine projected a vision of refinement. She filled her palaces with Enlightenment art, commissioned buildings in neoclassical design, and surrounded herself with thinkers whose writings echoed her own ideas of governance and order. Her correspondence with French philosophers, particularly Voltaire and Diderot, gave her a voice in the intellectual currents of the West. She did not merely observe Europe's age of reason, she positioned herself within it. At home, she pursued a legal codification project meant to clarify the structure of justice and reinforce state authority. Her nakaz, or instruction, written in the language of progress, emphasized rational law, equality before the courts, and the rejection of torture. Though much of it remained aspirational, the message was clear. Russia would no longer be seen as backward. It would compete in law, culture, and science. The Academy of Sciences expanded, printing presses increased, schools were established for girls as well as boys. The Russian elite were taught to speak in the language of philosophy, science, and refined politics. Yet even as Catherine invited this new order, she never relinquished control. Her reign depended on more than ideas. It was enforced through a growing apparatus of surveillance. The empire's size and complexity required eyes in every province, informants, couriers, local governors, who reported not only on taxes and grain, but on rumors, discontent, and deviation. the secret police expanded their reach, tasked with protecting the image of the state, which was now inseparable from the image of the Empress herself. Catherine's court became a space of both elegance and calculation. Her favored nobles received lands, titles, and positions of authority, but only as long as they remained useful. Some fell out of favor quickly, dismissed with little explanation. Others, like Prince Potemkin, remained close, shaping military campaigns and domestic policies alike. But even the most loyal were kept at a distance from true succession or permanent trust. Art, too, became a tool of power. Portraits were carefully composed to present Catherine not only as a woman, but as a ruler among men, draped in military sashes, standing beside columns of law. Architecture reflected imperial strength. Literature was encouraged, but censored. Plays could entertain, but not question. In public, Catherine embodied progress. In private, she understood the fragility of legacy. Every decision, every alliance, reform, and campaign was made with one eye on the present and the other on how it would be remembered. She had risen through strategy, not blood. Her hold on the throne had no ancient claim, and so she used culture to build one. The memory of rulers, she understood, did not live in the moment. It lived in the records they left behind, and in the silences they were able to maintain. By the final years of her reign, Catherine's court had changed in tone. The elegance remained, the chandeliers still glowed, the rituals still unfolded, but the atmosphere had grown heavier. Her last and youngest favorite, Prince Platon Zubov, entered the court not with military distinction or noble lineage, but with charm and influence that quickly hardened into control. He was in his early 20s when Catherine, now past 60, elevated him with titles and privileges once reserved for seasoned statesmen. He received vast estates, high military command, and unearned authority over state affairs. Older courtiers, some of whom had served her through wars and reforms, watched with quiet alarm. Her son, Paul, increasingly sidelined, viewed Zubov not just as a rival for affection, but as an obstacle to power. And across the empire's institutions, confidence in Catherine's clarity began to erode. Zubov's rise exposed more than favoritism. It revealed the narrowing of Catherine's inner circle. Many of her former advisors had died, retired, or been pushed aside. Those who remained did so cautiously, aware that proximity to the Empress could still bring reward, but also ruin. Catherine had once governed through broad consultation, balancing factions and perspectives. But in these later years, decisions moved more quickly, through fewer hands, and with less resistance. Zubov's access to documents, appointments, and military strategy bypassed traditional channels. His influence stretched beyond policy into the court's daily rhythms. Ambassadors took note, generals expressed concern in private letters, and among the imperial guard, loyalty began to split. Not openly, but in posture and rumor. Catherine, aware of the tension but unwilling to alter course, became more withdrawn in public and more rigid in policy. Her correspondence continued, her reforms pressed on, but her presence, once commanding and engaged, grew more distant. Physical exhaustion and age were not her only burdens. The shadows of her past stirred again. The memory of Peter III, the husband she overthrew, lingered in the eyes of those who questioned the foundation of her reign. The scars of Pugachev's revolt remained in the provinces. The sons of former rivals now occupied positions of power, and her own son, Paul, still waited, excluded from governance, surrounded by his own faction, and growing colder with time. Catherine's relationship with Paul had never healed. She viewed him as impulsive and emotionally unstable. He saw her as withholding and manipulative. Their interactions, even in ceremonial form, carried the weight of decades. Catherine feared what his rule might mean for the empire. She had even considered bypassing him in succession, drafting secret provisions that would elevate her grandson Alexander instead. But these papers remained hidden, unsigned, and the longer she hesitated, the more uncertain the future became. Zubov, for all his ambition, could not shape what came next. He had no claim, no legacy, only influence. Catherine's empire, once built on careful balance, now rested on a fragile web of secrecy, patronage, and urgency. Outside her private chambers, the palace moved as it always had. Guards posted, orders dispatched, banquets held. But those who knew the rhythms of power understood that a shift was coming. Not through declarations, but through gestures, through who was allowed into a room and who was left standing outside. The woman who had taken the throne by force now faced the quiet realization that she could not choose who would hold it next. In the early hours of November 17th, 1796, Catherine collapsed alone in her private study at the Winter Palace. The stroke left her without speech, unable to command or explain. Servants found her, but by the time physicians arrived, her authority had already begun to slip from her hands. For decades, she had shaped the Russian Empire with relentless control over military campaigns, legal reforms, foreign diplomacy, and courtly appointments. But now, in the stillness of that final morning, power moved without her. Her death came the next day. Official notices were sent, bells tolled, but inside the palace, ceremony quickly gave way to calculation. Catherine had not planned to die just then. Her intentions for succession were still in motion. For years, she had doubted her son Paul, his temperament, his rigidity, and his long-standing resentment. She feared that the empire she had built, with its delicate balance of nobility, military, and cultural reform, would fracture under his hand. In private, she had drafted a political testament, one that outlined a path bypassing Paul in favor of her grandson Alexander. But the document remained unsigned, locked away, its legal authority never confirmed. When news of her death spread, those who stood to lose under Paul's rule acted swiftly. Her closest advisors, those tied to her court, her vision, and her memory, sought to delay the transition. But they had no standing to resist. Paul moved quickly. He ordered Catherine's documents seized. Her private correspondence was secured. Her household was dismissed. Within hours, he was declared emperor. There was no debate. The throne, long withheld from him, was now his. And with that authority, he began to dismantle the legacy she had tried to preserve. He reversed many of her policies, issuing new edicts that rejected her code of legal reform and restored powers to traditional aristocratic factions. He recalled old officers she had exiled and dismissed generals she had raised. Even in architecture, he made changes, commissioning a new palace in his own image and removing Catherine's symbols from official court decoration. Her allies, once powerful, became quiet or disappeared from public view. The silence that followed her death was not the silence of mourning. It was the silence of repositioning. Foreign ambassadors waited for direction. Nobles rewrote their loyalties. Artists and writers who had thrived under her patronage paused their projects. uncertain of what would be allowed. Paul's new court reshaped the narrative. Where Catherine had ruled through charisma and reform, Paul insisted on order and hierarchy. Where she had invited Western influence and Enlightenment thought, he reasserted Russian traditions. Her name was still spoken, but less often. Her portraits remained, but their meaning had changed. In that transition, questions remained. What did Catherine truly fear in those final months? How close had she come to securing a different future? The signed will could have altered imperial history, but without it, her plans dissolved. And so, the woman who once commanded the vast machinery of empire left behind no final command, just silence. And in that silence, others stepped forward, rewriting the order she had spent a lifetime constructing. The accession of Paul I marked not only the beginning of a new reign, but the deliberate unraveling of the one before it. From the moment he assumed power, Catherine's son moved with clear intent, reversing her edicts, disbanding her councils, and removing those who had governed by her side. The reforms she had shaped over decades, policies on provincial administration, court culture, even military organization, were overturned in a matter of months. Paul saw his mother's rule not as a foundation to build upon, but as a deviation to correct. He dismissed her closest advisors, stripped titles from former allies, and sought to distance his court from the cosmopolitan tone she had carefully cultivated. Under his command, French ideas were suspect, Enlightenment thinkers unwelcome, and foreign admiration viewed as disloyalty. Catherine, once the face of Russian modernity, was recast as a figure of excess and arrogance. Yet the machinery of empire does not forget so easily. The systems she built, education for noble women, administrative rationalization, expanded state printing, remained in place even as her name was excised from official memory. The infrastructure of her rule had grown too large, too embedded, to be undone completely. Universities she had funded continued to operate. Libraries she had filled with Western texts still held their shelves. The governors she had trained under a new model of civil service had already left their imprint on regional governance. Paul could redirect policy, but the logic of a centralized, modernizing state, something she had spent a lifetime shaping, had already taken root. Still, in the court and capital, her presence dimmed. Portraits were moved. Correspondence was archived or destroyed. Public references to her legacy became rare. For those who had served her, silence became a form of survival. Former allies withdrew from political life or shifted their allegiance to Paul's new vision. Some were exiled. Others, stripped of status, faded into the provinces. Within the military, uncertainty grew. Catherine had promoted merit and innovation. Paul reintroduced rigid discipline and strict court formalities, modeling his rule on a vision of monarchy rooted in unquestioned hierarchy. He viewed the throne as sacred inheritance, not contested ground. His regime restored ceremonial distance and limited access to decision-making. The informal networks Catherine had once used to shape policy were now seen as subversion. Outside the palace, the people saw only fragments. The statues of Catherine remained in cities she had built or beautified, standing above squares and promenades. But the woman behind them no longer belonged to the state. Her memory had become a private matter, spoken in guarded tones, remembered through stories that lacked official sanction. And yet, in the quiet persistence of the institutions she left behind, her vision remained. Teachers still taught from her translated texts. Doctors trained in clinics she had founded. Governors issued orders in the administrative framework she had signed into law. Even Paul, in his effort to erase her influence, governed from the palace she had designed under laws she had once written. In this contrast between a legacy disowned and a system unshaken, Catherine's empire entered a new phase, not in her name and not in her image, but still marked by her hand, for legacies, unlike titles, cannot be seized. They can only be carried, reshaped, or resisted, and in that resistance, they often endure. Catherine II ruled for 34 years, but her influence stretched far beyond the length of her reign. She did not inherit the Russian throne by birthright. She claimed it through calculation, survival, and force. A German princess brought to Russia as a bride, she became something far more than the consort of an emperor. She became the state itself, first in shadow, then in light. Her rise was marked by a quiet transformation. From outsider to sovereign, from ornament to architect of empire. And through the decades that followed, she reshaped Russia with a vision that blended Enlightenment ideals with absolute power. Her reforms expanded education, her armies redrew borders, her letters corresponded with Europe's most celebrated thinkers. But her hands never left the reins of control. For every law code she commissioned, she reinforced autocracy. For every school she opened, she tightened her grip on serfs. Her legacy was not clean. It was layered, deliberate, and deeply human. In her, the contradictions of empire found a single figure. Catherine styled herself as a philosopher on the throne, writing essays on governance, exchanging ideas with men like Voltaire, Diderot, and Grimm. She championed reason, but ruled without a constitution. She promoted the arts, while censoring dissent. She expanded the frontiers of knowledge, yet maintained the hierarchies of class and privilege. In her court, elegance masked surveillance. Reforms moved forward, but always with limits drawn by political need. Her power, while vast, was constantly managed through loyalty, secrecy, and performance. She understood the mechanisms of monarchy not just as a system, but as a theater, one she directed with unmatched precision. Yet behind the grandeur, she governed a state defined by inequality, bound by feudal chains, and prone to rebellion. She promised progress, but feared disruption. And so, each step forward was weighted with caution. She ruled through men, but not under them. Her lovers became ministers, her favorites military commanders. She raised them, rewarded them, and discarded them as needed. They served at her pleasure, not out of romance, but utility. Her court became a reflection of her own approach to power, intimate, strategic, and controlled. Yet her strength did not erase scrutiny. Many saw in her relationships the weakness of emotion, others the cunning of manipulation. She was judged not only by her policies, but by her gender, praised as exceptional, criticized as unnatural. Still, she endured, and in enduring, she redefined what a woman could be in imperial power, not merely present, but dominant, not simply symbolic, but sovereign. Her reign left marks across continents. The annexation of Crimea, the partitioning of Poland, the rise of Russia as a Black Sea power, these were not accidental expansions. They were deliberate assertions of imperial ambition. Under her rule, Russia emerged not only as a vast landmass, but as a diplomatic force, its ministers negotiating in Vienna, its ships appearing in the Mediterranean, Its armies studied in European capitals. But with each conquest, the burdens of governance deepened, the serfs remained bound, the provinces remained restless, the dream of enlightened rule strained under the realities of empire. And as Catherine aged, the machinery of her state grew heavier, more complex, and harder to direct. Her final years were marked by a quiet urgency. She drafted plans for education reform, restructured provincial governments, and toyed with the idea of bypassing her son in succession. Her grandson, Alexander, young and promising, represented a future she could shape, but never would. The stroke that took her came without warning, and in its silence, decisions she had delayed were taken out of her hands. Her death was not dramatic, but what followed revealed how fragile legacy can be when it is tied to a single person. Today, Catherine remains one of the most debated rulers in Russian history. A woman who defied tradition, yet upheld autocracy. A foreigner who became a national symbol. A reformer whose reforms never reached the base of society. Her statues still stand, her writings still studied, her name still echoed across timelines of power. But what remains is not just her memory, it is the mirror she held up to empire. A mirror that reflects ambition, transformation, and control, but also compromise, silence, and the human cost of rule. Was she savior or shadow, visionary or tyrant? The answer does not lie in the speeches she gave or the portraits she commissioned. It lingers in the space she left behind, the shape of a woman who dared to bend history, and in doing so, became part of its weight.